Karl Rove leaned forward across the Fox News round table, his whiteboard marker already in hand, as he prepared to deploy the data visualization techniques that had made him famous during his years as a Republican strategist and election night analyst. The architect of George W. Bush's presidential victories had agreed to participate in what the network was billing as a special town hall on election integrity, and he had clearly arrived with the intention of using his reputation for political acumen and his command of electoral statistics to dismantle progressive arguments about voter suppression. Seated directly across from him was Jasmine Crockett, who had been invited to represent the Democratic perspective on voting rights legislation that was currently stalled in Congress. The format was designed to create confrontational television, with Rove positioned as the seasoned expert who would educate viewers about the real facts of American elections, while exposing the supposedly flawed logic underlying Democratic calls for expanded voting access. The studio audience consisted of voters from across the political spectrum, and the moderator had promised a substantive policy discussion that would move beyond partisan talking points to examine actual data about turnout, access, and election security. What Rove did not anticipate as the cameras began rolling was that the junior representative from Texas had spent her entire legal career constructing logical arguments that could withstand hostile cross-examination, and that his decades of spinning electoral data to serve Republican narratives had left him unprepared for an opponent who could systematically expose the fallacies embedded in analysis that sounded sophisticated but collapsed under logical scrutiny. Before we examine this extraordinary confrontation where rigorous reasoning dismantles carefully constructed spin and where statistical manipulation meets someone trained to identify exactly where arguments break down, make sure to subscribe and activate notifications so you never miss these defining moments when genuine expertise defeats practiced deflection and logical consistency exposes the rhetorical sleight of hand that passes for serious analysis in partisan media environments. The town hall had been conceived as part of Fox News's occasional efforts to present itself as a venue for serious policy debate rather than simply a platform for conservative messaging. The network's producers had recognized that voting rights and election integrity represented one of the most significant fault lines in American politics, and they had calculated that a direct confrontation between a prominent Republican strategist and a rising Democratic voice would generate substantial viewer interest while allowing them to claim they were facilitating important civic dialogue. Karl Rove had been an obvious choice to represent the Republican perspective given his historical role in shaping modern conservative electoral strategy and his continued prominence as a Fox News contributor whose analysis carried weight with Republican voters who valued his reputation for understanding the mechanics of winning elections. Jasmine Crockett's selection as the Democratic counterpart had been less obvious, but reflected Fox News' recognition that she had become one of the most effective communicators on voting issues, and that her presence would attract attention from progressive audiences who might not typically watch the network. The producers had apparently calculated that even if Crockett performed well, the format and the venue would advantage Rove by surrounding him with a familiar environment and an audience that would include substantial numbers of Republican voters predisposed to accept his analysis. What they had not fully considered was that Crockett's skills as a trial attorney and her experience in congressional hearings had prepared her precisely for situations where she would face hostile audiences and biased presentations, and that she had developed techniques for exposing flawed reasoning that worked regardless of the political composition of the room. The town hall began with opening statements from both participants. Rove used his time to establish what he characterized as the fundamental questions at stake in debates about voting policy. He argued that American democracy depended on elections being both accessible and secure, and that the challenge for policymakers was to find the right balance between these sometimes competing values. He suggested that Democrats had abandoned any concern for election security in their single-minded focus on maximizing turnout, while Republicans had worked to implement common-sense safeguards that protected the integrity of the electoral process without imposing unreasonable burdens on legitimate voters. He presented himself as the voice of reason and empiricism, someone who analyzed electoral data objectively rather than through an ideological lens. And he implied that his expertise gave him insights that partisan advocates like Crockett necessarily lacked. Crockett's opening statement took a different approach, focusing on the real-world experiences of voters who had faced obstacles when attempting to exercise their constitutional rights. She described specific individuals she had represented or encountered during her time in Congress, people who had been removed from voter rolls without notice, who had waited hours to vote because polling locations in their neighborhoods had been closed, who had been unable to obtain the identification documents required under new state laws. She argued that these were not isolated incidents, but rather reflected systematic patterns that resulted from policy choices designed to make voting more difficult for communities that tended to support Democratic candidates. She positioned the debate not as a technical question about balancing abstract values, but as a moral question about whether all Americans would be allowed to participate equally in determining their government. The format then shifted to a direct exchange between Rove and Crockett, with the moderator posing questions and allowing both participants to respond. The first several questions focused on voter identification requirements, and Rove used these opportunities to present what he characterized as compelling evidence that such requirements were both necessary and non-burdensome. He cited polling data showing that large majorities of Americans across partisan lines supported requiring identification to vote. He presented statistics indicating that the vast majority of Americans already possessed valid identification documents. He referenced studies claiming that voter identification laws had minimal impact on turnout. He argued that the same Democrats who opposed voter identification requirements had no problem with identification being required for numerous other activities, suggesting this revealed that their objections were pretextual rather than principled. Crockett responded to each of these points methodically, and it was in these responses that the fundamental difference in their approaches to logic and evidence became apparent. She began by addressing Rove's polling data about public support for voter identification requirements. She noted that how questions were worded in polls dramatically affected responses, and that generic questions about whether people should show identification to vote generated different results than questions about specific identification requirements and their implementation. She explained that when voters were informed about which documents would and would not be accepted under proposed laws, about the costs and difficulties involved in obtaining acceptable documents, and about the numbers of people who would be disenfranchised, support for these measures dropped substantially. The polling that Rove cited did not actually demonstrate public support for the specific policies that Republicans were implementing, but rather reflected that people supported an abstract principle without understanding its concrete application. She then addressed his claim that most Americans already possessed acceptable identification. She acknowledged that this was statistically true, but noted that Rove was committing a logical fallacy by assuming that because most people had identification, the impact on those who did not was therefore insignificant. She explained that millions of Americans lacked the specific forms of identification that many state laws required, that these Americans were disproportionately elderly, low income, and people of color, and that their constitutional rights mattered regardless of whether they constituted a statistical majority. She noted that Rove's logic would suggest that any policy was acceptable as long as it only harmed a minority of the population, a principle that obviously could not be sustained in a rights-based constitutional system. Rove attempted to interrupt with a clarification, but Crockett continued, noting that she was systematically addressing each of his points and that she would appreciate the same courtesy she had extended when he was speaking. She then turned to his claim that studies showed minimal turnout impacts from voter identification laws. She explained that Rove was selectively citing research and ignoring the substantial body of studies that had found measurable turnout suppression, particularly among minority voters. She noted that even studies finding small aggregate effects often revealed much larger impacts on specific demographic groups, and that whether one characterized these impacts as minimal or significant depended on normative judgments about how much disenfranchisement was acceptable. She suggested that Rove's willingness to dismiss turnout reductions as insignificant revealed that he was not actually engaged in objective analysis, but rather was applying value judgments that prioritized other considerations over maximizing democratic participation. The audience had grown notably quiet as Crockett systematically dismantled each element of Rove's presentation. What had appeared to be a strong empirical case when Rove presented it was revealed to be a collection of misleading statistics, logical fallacies, and selective citations that could not withstand careful scrutiny. Several audience members began nodding along with Crockett's analysis, apparently persuaded by her demonstration of where Rove's reasoning broke down. Rove recognized that he was losing ground and attempted to regain the initiative by shifting to what he clearly believed was stronger terrain. He pulled out his whiteboard and began drawing a chart showing voter turnout trends over time. He pointed to data indicating that turnout had increased in recent elections despite the implementation of stricter voting laws in many states, and he argued that this proved claims about voter suppression were empirically false. If voting restrictions were actually preventing people from voting, he insisted, we would see declining turnout rather than the increasing participation that the data revealed. He suggested that this single fact demolished the entire case for federal voting rights legislation, as it showed that access was not actually being restricted in ways that affected electoral participation. Crockett watched Rove complete his presentation and then asked the moderator for time to respond in detail to this argument, noting that it represented a perfect example of how sophisticated-sounding analysis could be deeply misleading when it ignored relevant context and made unwarranted logical leaps. The moderator granted her request, and what followed was a masterclass in how to deconstruct flawed reasoning. Crockett began by noting that Rove's argument depended on a basic logical error, the assumption that if turnout was increasing overall, then no, suppression could be occurring. She explained that this was analogous to arguing that because average income was rising, no one could be experiencing economic hardship. The aggregate number could increase while specific groups were being harmed, and focusing only on the overall trend obscured these disparate impacts. She noted that the eligible voter population was growing due to demographic changes, that political polarization was motivating higher baseline turnout across all groups, and that various factors were pushing participation upward. The question was not whether absolute turnout was increasing, but whether it was increasing as much as it would have in the absence of restrictive policies, and whether turnout gaps between different demographic groups were widening or narrowing. She then presented data that Rove had conveniently omitted from his analysis. She showed that while overall turnout had increased, the gap between white turnout and minority turnout had widened in states that had implemented restrictive voting laws, while narrowing in states that had expanded access. She explained that this pattern was exactly what one would expect if voting restrictions were having discriminatory effects, and that Rove's focus on aggregate turnout was designed to hide these disparities rather than illuminate them. She noted that an honest analyst would have examined differential impacts across groups rather than presenting only overall numbers that obscured the very phenomenon under investigation. Crockett then addressed the causal logic underlying Rove's argument. She noted that he was assuming that the absence of declining turnout proved that voting restrictions had no suppressive effect, but this assumption ignored the possibility that turnout would have been even higher without those restrictions. She explained that this was like arguing that because a patient was still alive, the poison they had been given must not be harmful. The proper analysis required comparing actual outcomes to counterfactual scenarios, and multiple studies using sophisticated statistical techniques had done exactly that, finding that restrictive voting laws reduced turnout among affected populations even when overall participation was increasing due to other factors. She then exposed what she characterized as the fundamental dishonesty in Rove's presentation. She noted that he had spent decades as a Republican strategist whose job was to help his party win elections, and that he had been intimately involved in developing the very voter identification laws and other restrictions that he was now defending. She stated that internal Republican documents that had emerged in litigation revealed that party strategists had explicitly discussed how voting restrictions would benefit Republican candidates by reducing turnout among Democratic-leaning constituencies. She quoted from depositions and emails where Republican officials had acknowledged that the partisan impact of these laws was a motivating factor in their enactment. She suggested that Rove's current pose as an objective analyst was impossible to credit given his role in developing strategies that were explicitly designed to manipulate turnout for partisan advantage. The impact of this rebuttal was visible across the studio. Rove's confident demeanor had been replaced by visible frustration as each element of his case was systematically demolished. Several audience members who had been nodding along with his initial presentation now appeared skeptical, having seen how his analysis collapsed when subjected to logical scrutiny. The moderator seemed uncertain how to proceed, as the format had assumed a rough balance between the two perspectives, but Crockett's superior command of logic and evidence had created a dynamic where one side was clearly prevailing. Rove attempted to recover by accusing Crockett of impugning his integrity and suggesting that she was making personal attacks rather than engaging with his substantive arguments. Crockett responded calmly that she had engaged extensively with his arguments and had shown precisely where his logic failed and his evidence was misleading. She noted that pointing out someone's professional history and potential conflicts of interest was not a personal attack, but rather relevant context for evaluating their claims to objectivity. She stated that if Rove wanted to be treated as a disinterested analyst rather than as a partisan advocate, he needed to present analysis that met basic standards of logical coherence and evidentiary completeness rather than cherry-picked data designed to support predetermined conclusions. The moderator then posed a question about election security and the need to prevent fraud, clearly hoping to move the discussion to terrain where Rove might be more successful. Rove seized this opportunity to argue that Democrats were reckless in their disregard for election security and that their opposition to common-sense safeguards revealed a troubling indifference to the integrity of democratic processes. He suggested that Republicans were willing to have honest debates about voting access, but that Democrats refused to acknowledge any legitimate role for security measures, preferring to characterize all restrictions as voter suppression regardless of their actual purpose or effect. Crockett responded by noting that this characterization was itself dishonest. She explained that Democrats supported numerous election security measures, including paper ballot backups, post-election audits, cybersecurity protections for election infrastructure, and adequate resources for election administration. She stated that what Democrats opposed were restrictions that were justified as security measures, but that actually served no meaningful security purpose and instead functioned primarily to reduce turnout among specific populations. She challenged Rove to identify a single piece of credible evidence that the IT types of in-person voter fraud that identification requirements were designed to prevent actually occurred at rates that could affect election outcomes. She noted that despite extensive investigations by Republican officials eager to prove that fraud was widespread, virtually no such cases had been documented, suggesting that these laws were solutions in search of a problem rather than responses to actual threats. She then turned the question back on Rove, asking him whether he believed that election security required only measures that reduced fraud or whether it also encompassed ensuring that all eligible voters could participate. She noted that elections could be undermined either through illegitimate votes being cast or through legitimate votes being suppressed, and that a comprehensive approach to election security needed to address both threats. She suggested that the Republican focus exclusively on the largely non-existent threat of fraud, while ignoring or actively contributing to the very real problem of voter suppression, revealed that their stated concerns about election security were pretextual. She argued that if Republicans genuinely cared about the integrity of elections, they would be equally concerned about eligible citizens being prevented from voting as they claimed to be about ineligible individuals casting ballots. The logic of this argument was difficult to escape, and its impact was evident in audience reactions. Several viewers who had appeared sympathetic to Rove's position now seemed uncertain, apparently recognizing that Crockett had identified a genuine inconsistency in how Republicans approached election security. The premise that security and access were competing values had been revealed as false, replaced by an understanding that both were essential components of genuine electoral integrity, and that focusing on one while ignoring the other suggested motivations beyond ensuring honest elections. As the town hall continued through additional questions on topics like mail-in voting, early voting periods, and polling place accessibility, the pattern established in these early exchanges persisted. Rove would present what appeared to be compelling evidence or logical arguments, and Crockett would systematically expose the fallacies, omissions, or misleading framings that made his case seem stronger than it actually was. She demonstrated repeatedly that his analysis relied on cherry-picked data, false equivalences, unwarranted assumptions, and logical leaps that could not survive scrutiny. What had been designed as a balanced debate between competing perspectives had become a demonstration of how partisan spin, masquerading as objective analysis, could be dismantled through rigorous logical reasoning and comprehensive engagement with evidence. The closing statements reflected how completely the dynamics had shifted over the course of the program. Rove used his time to reassert his original positions and to characterize disagreements as matters of interpretation rather than logic or evidence. His presentation lacked the confidence he had displayed at the beginning, and his attempts to portray himself as the voice of objective analysis rang hollow after Crockett had so thoroughly documented the partisan bias underlying his supposedly neutral observations. Crockett used her closing to summarize the key logical failures she had identified in Rove's arguments and to restate the affirmative case for protecting and expanding voting access. She emphasized that ensuring all eligible Americans could vote was not a partisan issue, but a fundamental democratic imperative, and that those who opposed such efforts needed to provide honest justifications rather than hiding behind misleading statistics and fallacious reasoning. The audience reaction as the program concluded was notably mixed, with substantial applause for Crockett, even from sections of the crowd that had seemed initially skeptical of her positions. The post-program analysis on Fox News itself reflected uncertainty about how the confrontation had played, with some commentators praising the substantive nature of the debate, while others awkwardly tried to present the exchange as more balanced than it had actually been. The consensus among neutral observers was that Crockett had decisively prevailed, not through rhetorical tricks or emotional appeals, but through superior command of logic and evidence that exposed the weakness of arguments that had long gone unchallenged in conservative media environments. The broader impact of the town hall extended well beyond the immediate audience. Clips of Crockett dismantling Rove's arguments circulated widely on social media, with many viewers expressing surprise at seeing such effective pushback against a figure who had long been treated as an authoritative voice on electoral matters. Legal scholars and political scientists praised her analysis, noting that she had articulated complex methodological and logical points in accessible language that made sophisticated arguments comprehensible to general audiences. Democratic strategists studied the exchange as a model for how to respond to Republican talking points on voting issues, recognizing that Crockett had demonstrated the importance of engaging with conservative arguments directly rather than simply asserting alternative positions. For Karl Rove personally, the confrontation represented a significant blow to his reputation as a master strategist and astute political analyst. He had entered the exchange expecting to easily dominate a relatively junior member of Congress, and instead he had been systematically outmatched by someone whose legal training and commitment to logical rigor proved more powerful than his decades of experience in political spin. His claims to objectivity had been exposed as hollow, his statistical analyses revealed as misleading, and his logical arguments shown to be riddled with fallacies. The Thai episode demonstrated that expertise in winning elections did not necessarily translate to expertise in defending the fairness of electoral systems, and that partisan advocates could not credibly pose as neutral analysts regardless of how sophisticated their presentations appeared. For Jasmine Crockett, the town hall provided another platform to demonstrate the effectiveness of approaching political debates as exercises in logical reasoning, rather than simply exchanges of competing talking points. Her ability to identify precisely where arguments broke down, to expose unstated assumptions that could not withstand scrutiny, and to present complex analytical points in clear and compelling language, had proven devastatingly effective against an opponent whose reputation had insulated him from serious challenge. She had shown that rigorous thinking and honest engagement with evidence remained powerful tools in political discourse, even in environments designed to favor spin over substance. If this account of logical reasoning triumphing over statistical manipulation resonated with you, subscribe now and enable notifications so you never miss these crucial moments when intellectual honesty defeats practiced deflection and rigorous analysis, exposes the weakness of arguments that sound sophisticated but collapse under scrutiny. Share this story with anyone who values evidence-based policy debates and believes that partisan spin, regardless of how expertly delivered, should not go unchallenged when it obscures, rather than illuminates, important questions about democratic participation and electoral integrity. The ongoing struggle to ensure that all eligible Americans can vote and that policy debates are grounded in honest analysis, rather than misleading statistics, continues in legislatures and media venues across the nation. And supporting that effort requires citizens who can recognize the difference between genuine expertise and partisan advocacy, dressed in the language of objectivity.